Well, for Tuesday, we thought we'd show you guys some stuff that we found around here that has something to do with the railroad or nothing to do with the railroad.
It's a point of interest.
It's a point of interest. There's a lot of things going on around here, and most of it is railroad oriented. But a lot of the railroads that used to be around here are no longer around here, but that's okay because that just makes for some really interesting ghost railroads and old railroad grades and stuff. So there's plenty of stuff to see around here other than the Gathering of Victorian Locomotives. The big juggernaut around here was the Denver and Rio Grande, later known as the Denver and Rio Grande Western, but originally it was just called the Denver and Rio Grande. This is a map of the entire system, and it started here in Denver in 1870, and they built south all the way down to this point, and then at this point the railroad split into two lines. One went up through the Royal Gorge to the mining districts around Leadville, and then the main line continued south. And the plan was to build all the way to El Paso, Texas, at the Mexican border. But if you'll notice, this track running down through here doesn't say Rio Grande, it says AT&SF, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. Now, it seems that the Rio Grande got into a bit of a disagreement with the Santa Fe. They were both disagreeing over who got track rights where, and actual gunslingers were hired, Bat Masterson, and money was paid, and things went to court. Eventually, the Santa Fe built the railroad south, and that meant that the Denver and Rio Grande would have to sort of rethink their whole plan. So anyway, they changed the name to the Denver and Rio Grande Western and decided to continue this line west all the way to Salt Lake City. You know, their original plan was to build all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And they were going to call it like the Rio Grande and Pacific or something. Now, there's all these other little branch lines off of that main line that went to various mining districts and so on, and we've had a close relationship with a couple of them. This one is the Heber Valley Railroad, and we've gone up there on several excursions. That's a scenic railroad now, the Heber Creeper. And this branch line down here, well, you know a good deal about that.
Right, the Sanpete Valley Railroad.
Yeah, it goes all the way down to Marysvale, the Marysvale branch.
Right.
And you grew up on this line.
I did.
Yeah, and we did a video, here's a link to it, about that Marysvale branch and how it ended up being abandoned and a few things like that. Well, let's jump back over to here. This is an interesting branch line that ran off to the west, the San Juan extension. Now, the railroad was originally 3-foot gauge, but later it was standard gauged, and this section here was relayed standard gauge as far as Alamosa, but the rest of the San Juan extension was left narrow gauge. They just couldn't see a need to widen it. The section down to Antineto, between Alamosa and Antineto, was dual gauge. And look how cool that is. It's you can actually run both standard and narrow gauge trains on the same track. That makes for a rather complicated looking switch.
No kidding.
I would hate that. Well, actually, I modeled my railroad, my HO scale railroad, that way. Part of it was done in dual gauge like that. And yeah, it's a bit of a hassle, frankly. But this way, the standard gauge trains can ride on the outside rails, and the narrow gauge trains can ride on the inside rail. And you can even mix and match them as long as you're careful about going to something like a Y, which would cause the whole thing to derail. At any rate, here in Antineto, where the Gathering of Victorian Locomotives is being held, the standard gauge rail ran out. It was the end of standard gauge, and from this point on it was exclusively narrow gauge. And there's the spot right there. You can see the outside rail simply ended, and the rest of the San Juan extension was all narrow gauge, all the way from Antineto across this entire section to Durango. And then at Durango, the line split into two different lines, one up to Silverton, And then there was another line off to the south, the Chile line, that ran down to Farmington, New Mexico. Again, all in narrow gauge. It was never standard gauged. So I guess there just never was enough of a market out here to justify spending the money on putting in standard gauge. It was always kind of a marginal thing. The hub of activity was always Alamosa, and they did the servicing on all of the narrow gauge engines. And because it was narrow gauge, they really couldn't modernize or didn't have an interest in modernizing to diesels. And so they just continued to run steam engines all the way to 1968.
Wow.
Think of that. They continued to run daily trains out of Alamosa and Antineto through that entire period. Well, I had a chance, fortunately, to come out here to Alamosa and see the roundhouse. It was after all of this had been abandoned. But the old roundhouse was still here, and a lot of the dual gauge track was still in place. There was even a DNRG long caboose in the roundhouse.
It makes me wonder what happened to it.
I assume that it found its way eventually over to the Cumbers and Toltec, but who knows? It was just there in one of the stalls at the roundhouse in about 1990. Well, all through the 1950s and 1960s, this was the popular place to come if you were into steam trains or narrow gauge, because it was all still here. And they were still running this train, the San Juan, the narrow gauge passenger train. And the popular part to ride was, of course, the part from Durango up to Silverton.
That's a nice ride, though.
Oh, it's an incredible ride. And it's one of two sections that managed to survive. They finally abandoned the line, as I say, in 1968. The last train went over this line just 2 weeks before the first manned flight to the moon.
Oh, boy.
Isn't that something?
That's wild.
Anyway, we thought we would go check out the line. It's still in place and still marginally being used, that runs between Alamosa and Antineto.
It's really neat, too.
There's some really cool places along here. The railroad serves several grain elevators, but if you look closely, look at that.
Right.
You can see where the third rail used to be, the dual gauge track. And you can see where the spike holes are and even where tie plates have worn into the ties. Some of the ties have been replaced, but a lot of the ties still show wear from the original narrow gauge track that came through here, the third rail, if you will. Some of the road crossings also show where there used to be dual gauge. And then we found this cool bridge.
That's really neat.
Isn't that neat? And I can just see in my mind's eye what this looked like with narrow gauge K36s crossing this truss bridge here. Now, they used to mix and match the standard gauge and narrow gauge cars as long as you had something called an idler car in between that had a narrow gauge coupler on one end and a standard gauge coupler on the other end. You could actually use a narrow gauge locomotive to pull standard gauge cars or a standard gauge locomotive to pull narrow gauge cars and mix and match the whole thing as you went. This is the station at Lahar. And isn't that pretty?
That's neat.
Lahar in general is just a really neat little town, but it's really cool to see the old depot in excellent shape like this. And it isn't just Lahar. The Alamosa depot is in really great shape as well. And until just a couple of years ago, it was surprisingly still being used. Until just a few years ago, this was being used by the Rio Grande Scenic Railroad, and they were taking passenger trains up to La Vida Pass and back.
Oh, wouldn't that be a fun trip?
Oh, wanted to go on that, but I guess the railroad is permanently closed.
Oh, that's sad.
That's sad, but the depot is still being used as a railroad museum. And it's neat to see the old timetables and everything. It's pretty much like it was when it was being used by the narrow gauge, except as I say, they've turned it into something of a railroad museum. And that was neat to see.
That is neat.
Yeah.
They've really done a terrific job on this.
Yeah, I was impressed.
No kidding.
Well, I'm impressed by lanterns, and they have some
There
here.
you go.
Anyway, we did take a quick tour around the yards here just to see what's left of the old Rio Grande Scenic. and all the equipment and everything is still here. It's just not being used anymore. The whole thing's been abandoned. But we did find some really interesting things around here.
What in the world is that?
Well, that will have to wait for next week.
Oh,
We'll pick it up right here on next Tuesday.
don't pick that up.
Well, not without a tetanus shot.
No.
Well, if you're not a subscriber, please subscribe, and you can do that by clicking on the blue button coming up right there. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring, and we will see you on Sunday and hopefully back here on Tuesday, because we're going to be picking this up.
Oh.
Bye-bye.